Welcome back. In episode 1 of this series we talked about what reasons are, and in episode 2 we talked about moral reasons, in episode 3 we talked about the role of emotions in rationality. As always, I recommend watching those first, otherwise this one might not make sense. Throughout this series we've identified the importance of being open-minded to reasons we might not have previously considered, and in this fourth and final episode we're going to be asking what open-minded means. Part 1. Justice. In episode 3, I mentioned an idea called epistemic injustice. The idea is that part of being a human being is having the ability to hold and impart knowledge. If we imagine the sum total of human knowledge as a pool, we can contribute to and borrow from that pool. And the philosopher Miranda Fricker argues that under certain circumstances, to prevent people from accessing that pool is really to do them a wrong. The example she uses is from the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, a story set in 1930s Alabama in which a black man named Tom Robinson is accused of raping a white woman called Mayella Ewell. In fact, Mayella came on to Tom consensually and her injuries came from her own father. In the story there's plentiful evidence of this, but the all-white jury do not believe Tom's innocence and vote to convict. Fricker describes this as testimonial injustice. The racial prejudice of the jury prevents Tom from adding the knowledge of his innocence to the pool. And the philosopher Jose Medina expands on Fricker's work in his own book, The Epistemology of Resistance. He writes that the central problem in To Kill a Mockingbird isn't just that the white jury disbelieve Tom because he's black, although that is a big part of what happens. They also can't imagine that a white woman would willingly try to seduce a black man. In that jury's world, black men are thought of as being A, inferior, and B, dangerously sexually aggressive, and white women are thought of as lacking sexual agency, as being passive. So the idea that a white woman would actively try to seduce a black man has never really seriously crossed the jury's mind before, and so when they're told that's what happened, they instantly dismiss it. Medina writes, "The central problem is not that Tom Robinson's testimonial authority is discredited, but rather that certain affects and relations have been rendered incredible, in fact almost unintelligible in that culture. And achieving justice becomes practically impossible in that culture until those affects and relations become imaginable, until they can be thought meaningfully, and those who lay claim to them do not become discredited by those very claims." And the problem goes even deeper than that too. It's not just that the white jury are unaware of the possibility of what happened, they are unaware of the fact that they are unaware. They assume, wrongly, that they can imagine all the relevant possibilities, rather like many of the people we mentioned in episode 3. This is the opposite of being open-minded, and Medina calls it meta-blindness. Although really, blindness isn't a very good metaphor, because blind people are aware that there's something they can't perceive. By contrast, the meta-blind ignoramus arrogantly assumes that there is nothing else to perceive beyond what she can see or hear. Also, it isn't very nice to compare blind people to racists, so, therefore, maybe a better term would be meta-ignorance. Part 2. Unknown unknowns. So what is meta-ignorance specifically, and how does it happen? Well, it's partially a failure of the social imaginary. By social imaginary we mean all the stories, symbols, institutions and values that go into making a society. If each of us has a picture of the world in our heads, then the social imaginary is the colours and brushes that we use to paint that picture. In To Kill a Mockingbird, the white jury live in a deeply racist society, and so the colours and brushes they have access to don't allow them to paint a picture in which a white woman willingly tries to seduce a black man who is then accused of a horrible crime he didn't commit. But meta-ignorance is more than that, too. After all, the jury are literally able to imagine that scenario. During the trial they're presented with it and they can entertain it, but they do not allow themselves to see Tom's testimony as a way that a human being like themselves could see the world. They don't really recognise it as a picture of the world at all. To them, that scenario is purely hypothetical, because they don't want to think of Tom as a human being like them, a subject who can perceive the world in much the same way they do. that might prompt them to ask themselves why it is they enjoy the benefits of his racial oppression, which might be a little bit uncomfortable for them. What this shows us is that meta-ignorance isn't just a failure of imagination, it's also a failure of empathy. In addition, and this really is the key, the jury don't have self-knowledge of their own position in society. They are, of course, aware that they are white and that Tom is black, but they aren't really aware of what that means for his experience of the world as a human being. Nor are they particularly interested in finding out. Rather like many of the people we talked about in episode 3, Aristotle, Thomas Carlyle, Lord Cromer, all thought that they could observe the situation objectively, but weren't aware of how their own positions in society might affect what they thought rationality was. So meta-ignorance is a failure of imagination, empathy, and self-knowledge. How does this kind of deep meta-ignorance come about? Well, the opposite of meta-ignorance is open-mindedness. Open-mindedness doesn't just mean allowing others to speak. The liberal tendency is to think that by giving everyone 2 minutes of uninterrupted speaking time, we've ticked the open-minded box, but really that's not enough. After all, the jury allowed Tom Robertson to literally have his day in court. They hear him speak and describe the scenario, although they would never have imagined it themselves, but they're still not open-minded. Open-mindedness means seeing the world from someone else's point of view, seeing yourself from someone else's point of view, and understanding your own social position relative to theirs. Medina says that the white jury in the story, and privileged subjects generally, have never really had to do that before. They've never had to see themselves as white from the point of view of a black man in a racist society, whereas Tom has had to see himself through their eyes every day of his life. In his book The Souls of Black Folk, American thinker W.E.B. Du Bois talks about double consciousness, the need for African Americans to understand how white Americans see them in order to survive. This is reflected in the talk that some African American parents have to give their kids about how their perfectly innocent actions might be seen by racist police officers who carry guns. Unfortunately, that kind of double consciousness is necessary, although it shouldn't be. Something similar is demanded when women are encouraged to think about how they dress and how they act, in order to be aware of how predatory men might perceive them as consenting even when they're not, or when trans people have to worry about whether or not they'll pass in public. Again, that's a shame and it goes at the wrong end of the problem, but double consciousness is what's being encouraged there. Seeing oneself as someone else in a different social position might see you. Whereas, relatively privileged subjects, like the white jury in To Kill a Mockingbird and Thomas Carlyle and Aristotle and Lord Cromer and so on, have never really needed double consciousness. They've never been coerced into seeing themselves as someone else sees them. Their own conception of their self is quite enough for them to survive, thanks very much. Medina writes, as a result of not ever having the experience of running into cultural limitations that render their experiences, problems, and even their lives unintelligible, as a result of not ever feeling severely constrained as speakers and subjects of knowledge, privileged subjects tend to be particularly reluctant to acknowledge the limitations of the horizon of understanding that they inhabit. That is, they tend to be blind to their own blindness. Part 3. Art. We've learned that meta-ignorance is a failure of imagination, empathy, and self-knowledge. So how do we counter it? How do we become open-minded? Well, I think that art is one potential solution. Art presents us with different ways of imagining the world by showing us new perspectives that we haven't thought of before. It enriches the social imaginary. It also stops us from reducing open-mindedness to a box-ticking exercise by putting the emotional, affective, empathetic response on the front foot. I'm talking here mainly about the kind of art that encourages us to empathise with somebody, be they a character in a film or a novel or a TV show, or the subject of a work of art, or the artist themselves. There are forms of art that don't rely on empathy, and they're all very cool and interesting in their own right, but Medina says that the first step to becoming open-minded is realising that one's own perspective is a perspective among many, not the way things are. And one way of achieving that, I think, is by seeing how other people see the world. This might be why fascist societies have tended to be quite heavy on artistic censorship. Censorship doesn't just occur under fascism, and there's lots of reasons fascist regimes do it, obviously, but we can see why anything that prompts people to imagine things in radically different ways or empathise with people that the social imaginary normally excludes might be a challenge to conservative and reactionary regimes. The Nazis, for instance, believed in degenerate art. They thought that all modern art was a Jewish conspiracy to undermine them, and insisted that art should embody the racist and militarist ideas they supported. Sadly, the idea that all modern art is somehow lacking, incomprehensible, or morally lesser still has traction amongst reactionaries today. Medina's work does come with a warning, though. It's not enough for us to just present somebody with a scenario that they've never thought of before. You could give a racist white person To Kill a Mockingbird and they could read it and they might still be racist at the end of it because they've read it as a racist white person with their own particular interpretations of what happened, despite the fact they haven't imagined a scenario like that before. For those of us who are artists, it's not enough to just present a new scenario. We have to encourage our audiences to reevaluate their own perspectives relative to that one. As an example, I went to see a play a while ago about the Brixton riots, which were a series of battles in 1981 between predominantly black Londoners in Brixton and the Metropolitan Police, who had been harassing and brutalising them for months. The play did an amazing job of showing a different perspective to a white audience. It followed this one black family in Brixton who were just trying to do as they were told and keep their heads down over a series of months building up to the riot. And it did a great job of showing all the different perspectives in the family. Like, at the beginning the son was like, we need to fight back, and he was really militant. The dad was all like, no, you just need to calm down, just keep your head down. And the grandma was like, oh, you should have seen what it was like when I arrived, things used to be so much worse, you've got it easy. The daughters in the family were there going, it's not just happening to you men, we want to be involved in this as well. And over the months they are subjected to more and more racist police violence until they can't take it anymore and they join the riot. That play did a great job of presenting an unfamiliar scenario to a white audience, of showing what is it like to be on the receiving end of racist police violence, how does this make people feel. Where it all fell apart for me was a subplot involving the daughter of the family dating a white cop, who at the climax of the play dies defending her in the riot from other police officers who we never see. The reason that made the whole play fall apart for me is that the only white character in the story didn't need to learn or change or grow, despite having chosen to be an agent of racist state violence. So although the play showed another perspective brilliantly, it didn't really encourage us to reevaluate our own perspectives relative to that one. Instead, it more or less explicitly gave us a get out of jail free card and kind of implied that the real victims of racist policing are white cops, which is a bit... It's by encouraging an audience to think of themselves differently in relation to others that we can begin chipping away at meta-ignorance. Over the course of this series, we've discussed what rationality is, and we've learned perhaps that it's more than we might have initially thought. I hope that you've encountered something that you've never heard of before, and I suppose the task for all of us now is to continue re-evaluating our own rationalities relative to what we learn. If you liked this series, I have a tip jar at paypal.me/philosophytube. Think of it like me putting a hat round at the end of the lecture. Or patreon.com/philosophytube is where you could make a monthly donation to help keep me making videos like this one. And don't forget to subscribe.